My name is Nicole, and I am 33 years old. I work as a supply chain risk director in Seattle, dealing with global logistics and million-dollar contracts every single day. I am trained to predict disasters before they happen, but somehow I never saw the collapse of my own family coming. My life for the past decade has been a series of spreadsheets and strategic planning. I was the one who made sure everything ran smoothly, not just at work, but for my parents and my sister Brittany. I was the golden child, the reliable one, and most importantly, the one with the high-limit credit cards. 2 days before Thanksgiving, I was sitting in my office finishing a report when my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. I expected it to be about the wine I was supposed to bring or the time I should arrive. Instead, it was a cold digital dismissal. My mother told me that the whole family was coming for Thanksgiving this year, but that I was not welcome. She said this holiday was about Brittany and her husband Andre, and she did not want me to ruin it with my intensity. I stared at the screen for a long time, trying to process the words. I am the one who pays the mortgage on their house. I am the one who covered Brittany's wedding debt. I am the one who pays for the very heat that would be warming them while they ate turkey without me. I called my mother immediately, but she didn't even let me finish a sentence. She hissed through the phone that Brittany feels judged by me because I am single and focused on work while she is building a family. She said Andre agrees that my presence makes everyone uncomfortable. They wanted a peaceful night without me flaunting my money or looking down on Andre's failing business ventures. My mother told me to just send the wine over and stay home. Then she hung up on me. The rejection felt like a physical blow, but as a risk director, my mind immediately shifted into a different gear. I looked at the Rolex on my wrist and the Chanel bag in my office, and then I looked at a long-ignored email from corporate headquarters. It was an offer for a regional director position in Chicago. I had turned it down for years because I wanted to stay near my family to protect them. But as I sat in the silence of my office, I realized that the only person I needed to protect was myself. I hit reply and accepted the transfer with one condition: I wanted to be on a plane within 48 hours. After my mother hung up on me, the silence in my office felt heavier than any million-dollar contract dispute I had ever handled. I sat there in my ergonomic chair staring at the rain, blurring the Seattle skyline, and I realized that my family didn't see me as a daughter or a sister, but as a faceless ATM with an infinite balance. I had spent years being their safety net. I paid the property taxes on the house at 42 Maple Drive, and I covered the insurance for the car my father drove. I had even paid for the ring light and the high-speed internet that Andre used for his struggling career as a lifestyle influencer. But the text from Brittany was what finally sharpened my resolve into a blade. She sent me a screenshot of a digital invitation she had designed for the dinner. The header read the Grand Thanksgiving Reveal, and the guest list included everyone from her yoga instructor to Andre's college roommates. Every name was there except mine. I was the only one excluded from the house I was literally buying for them. I didn't cry because my training as a risk director wouldn't allow it. Instead, I leaned into the logistics. I opened my personal banking portal and looked at the auto payments. For 5 years, $2,800 had been deducted from my checking account on the first of every month to pay the mortgage for my parents. I hovered my mouse over the cancel button. I thought about my father's favorite recliner and the kitchen where I learned to cook. But then I remembered my mother's voice saying, just send the wine and stay home. I clicked the button. A confirmation window popped up asking if I was sure this action would halt all future payments. I clicked yes without a second thought. I wasn't just stopping the mortgage, I was stopping the flow of my life's energy into people who treated me like an inconvenience. Next, I contacted Mr. Henderson, the vice president in Chicago. I told him I wouldn't just take the job, I would be there by Monday morning. I spent the next 12 hours in a fever of productivity. I called a high-end moving company that specialized in quick transitions and told them I needed my entire Seattle apartment packed and put into storage within 24 hours. I sold my car to a dealership down the street for cash and finalized the lease termination on my rental. While I was packing, I saw the notification on my phone from the smart home security system at my parents' house. I saw my mother through the doorbell camera. She was laughing as she welcomed a catering crew from Giordano's, the most expensive Italian deli in town. I watched as they unloaded crates of gourmet food that were billed to my corporate account on file. I logged into the catering portal and didn't just cancel the order, I deleted my entire profile. By the time the sun began to rise over the sound, I was standing in an empty apartment with nothing but 2 suitcases and a carry-on. My phone was blowing up with messages from the family group chat, discussing the decorations and the menu. They were talking about the expensive vintage bottles I was supposed to send over as if I were a delivery service. I ignored every single one of them. I headed to the airport and checked into a first-class lounge. As I sat there sipping black coffee, I looked at the mortgage documents one last time. The house wasn't just under my name for the mortgage, I was the sole owner on the deed. My parents had sold it to me for $1 years ago when they were facing bankruptcy, and I had kept it that way to protect their equity. They had forgotten that they were guests in my property. As the gate agent announced the boarding for my flight to Chicago, I felt a strange sense of peace. The disaster I had predicted for so long had finally arrived, and for the first time I wasn't going to be the one to fix it. As my plane touched down in the freezing wind of Chicago, I turned my phone on and watched the notifications flood the screen like a digital avalanche. It was now late afternoon on the day before Thanksgiving, the exact time when the gourmet catering from Giordano's was supposed to arrive at 42 Maple Drive. In Seattle, my mother Brenda was likely busy setting the table with the fine china I had bought her during my trip to Paris. She would be arranging the silk flowers and telling Andre where to set up his tripod to capture the perfect aesthetic for his followers. She had no idea that the foundation of her social status was already crumbling. The first crack appeared when the catering manager called her to inform her that the credit card on file had been declined and the account deleted. My mother probably tried to call me a dozen times, but I had already changed my settings so that her calls went straight to a deadline voicemail. I checked into my new executive suite overlooking Lake Michigan, a place provided by the company as part of my relocation package. The silence of the high-end apartment was a stark contrast to the chaos I knew was erupting back home. Through my security app, I watched the live feed of the driveway. My mother was standing on the porch, her face a mask of confusion and growing anger as she argued with a delivery driver who was refusing to hand over the crates of food without a new form of payment. I saw my father Gary come out of the house looking frazzled. He reached for his wallet, but I knew exactly what was in there. He only carried a small allowance of cash that I provided for him every week. When he realized he couldn't cover the $3,000 bill, the delivery driver simply loaded the food back into the van and drove away, leaving my parents standing in the cold, with an empty kitchen and 50 hungry guests arriving in less than 24 hours. The panic in the family group chat reached a fever pitch. Brittany started tagging me incessantly, asking why the catering was canceled and demanding that I fix the glitch immediately. She told the group that Andre had promised his fans a live-streamed gourmet feast and that I was being irresponsible by not answering my phone. She even had the audacity to say that my lack of communication was typical of my selfish nature. I sat on my plush velvet sofa in Chicago, watching the messages scroll by, while I enjoyed a quiet meal of room-service steak and expensive red wine. I realized then that they truly believed the money I provided was a natural resource, like air or water, something that just existed for their benefit without effort or sacrifice on my part. They didn't even consider for a second that I might have finally reached my breaking point. As the sun set in Seattle, I saw through the camera that the lights in the house were flickering. I had forgotten that the utility accounts were also linked to my primary credit card. When I reported my card as lost to the bank earlier that morning to secure my new accounts, it triggered an automatic suspension of all linked recurring payments. Suddenly, the house was not only empty of food, but the heat was cutting out and the high-speed internet that was the lifeblood of Andre's influencer career was gone. I watched my father pace the living room with a flashlight, while my mother sat at the dining table, probably realizing for the first time that the guest list might be final. But the guest of honor, the one who made the entire lifestyle possible, was gone for good. I leaned back and looked at the Chicago skyline, feeling a cold professional satisfaction. I wasn't just moving to a new city, I was moving into a new life, where my value wasn't measured in dollars per month. Thanksgiving morning in Chicago arrived with a brutal frost that mirrored the cold clarity in my heart. While I dressed in a soft cashmere sweater and prepared to explore my new neighborhood, I decided to check the digital pulse of the disaster unfolding in Seattle. My phone was nearly vibrating off the nightstand. The family group chat had transformed from a planning committee into a war room filled with accusations and frantic pleas. My mother had spent the night in a house that was slowly losing its warmth, and she had clearly spent those hours trying to find someone to blame. The latest messages were from Brittany, who was hysterical because her grand Thanksgiving reveal was falling apart. She had thousands of followers waiting for a live stream tour of a luxury holiday, and instead she was sitting in a dark living room with a dead router. I logged into the smart home portal one last time before I planned to disable my access entirely. The scene was pure chaos. Because the high-speed internet had been cut, Andre was standing on the front lawn, holding his phone high in the air, trying to catch a stray 5G signal, so he could explain to his sponsors why the content was delayed. Inside, my father was trying to restart the furnace, but since the service contract had lapsed and the bill was unpaid, the system remained stubborn and silent. My mother was in the kitchen surrounded by half-empty bags of groceries. They had scavenged from a local 24-hour convenience store at 3 a.m. Gone were the Giordano's truffles and the imported cheeses. In their place were generic brand chips and frozen pizzas. The contrast between the silver platters on the table and the cheap food was a perfect metaphor for their entire existence. Then the phone call started from a number I didn't recognize. I knew it was Gary using a neighbor's phone or a burner. I answered it just to hear the tone of his voice. "Nicole," he shouted as soon as he heard the line open. He didn't ask if I was okay or where I was. He immediately demanded to know what was wrong with my bank accounts. He told me the mortgage company had sent an automated alert saying the payment was missed and that the utilities were being shut off one by one. He sounded terrified not of losing me, but of losing the comfort I provided. I told him calmly that there was no glitch. I explained that since I wasn't on the guest list, I assumed my financial contributions weren't on the guest list either. I told him I had taken a new job and moved across the country, and that the house at 42 Maple Drive was officially no longer my responsibility to maintain. The silence on the other end of the line was the most honest thing I had heard from him in years. Then came the explosion. My mother must have been listening because she grabbed the phone and began screaming that I was a monster. She called me a traitor and said I was trying to kill them by leaving them in a cold house on a holiday. She had the nerve to say that I owed them for my upbringing and that the house was their home. I reminded her very quietly that the house was my property on the deed and that I had been a generous landlord for 5 years. I told her that if she wanted a traditional Thanksgiving where everyone was equal like she had said on the phone, then she could start by paying her equal share of the property taxes. I hung up before she could respond, and I blocked the new number. I walked out into the Chicago air, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. They were finally going to learn that a guest list has a price, and they had just spent their last cent of my patience. The time in Seattle reached 2 in the afternoon, which was the official start time for the grand Thanksgiving reveal party. In Chicago, I was sitting in a quiet upscale cafe overlooking the frozen river, watching the drama unfold through a series of frantic Instagram stories, posted by Andre and a few early arriving guests. Because Andre had managed to tether his phone to a weak hotspot, the world got to see the reality of the Harrison household without the filter of my money. The guests began to arrive in their holiday, best expecting the luxury they had been promised on the digital invitations. Instead, they were met with a house that felt like a walk-in freezer. I saw a video posted by one of Andre's roommates showing people huddled in their heavy winter coats, standing around the formal dining room table, where the silver candelabras were holding flickering emergency candles, because the electricity was now fully cut. My mother was trying to maintain her composure, playing the role of the elegant hostess, but her breath was visible in the cold air of the living room. There was no smell of roasting turkey or expensive herbs. Instead, the kitchen counter was a graveyard of cardboard boxes from a local fast food chain that Gary had managed to buy with the last of his emergency cash. I watched a live-streamed clip where a guest asked why it was so dark, and Brittany, with her voice trembling from both cold and embarrassment, claimed that they were going for a rustic candlelit aesthetic to celebrate the true meaning of the holiday. But the lie didn't hold for long. One of the guests, who was a real estate agent, commented loudly that the house looked like it had been foreclosed on. The look of pure panic on my mother's face in the background of that video was a masterpiece of poetic justice. Inside the house, the tension was reaching a breaking point. My mother and Brittany were now arguing in the hallway, oblivious to the fact that someone's phone was still recording. I heard my mother scream that Nicole was doing this on purpose to humiliate them. She wasn't worried about the fact that her daughter had moved away. She was worried that her friends were seeing the generic brand soda and the plastic forks. Andre was frantically trying to delete comments on his latest post as people started to realize the grand reveal was actually a grand collapse. He had built his entire online persona on the image of a successful man living in a high-end estate, and now his followers were seeing the truth that he was just a squatter in a dark house, with no food and no future. The facade was not just cracking, it was being pulverized. Then the final blow to their pride arrived in the form of a knock on the door. It wasn't more guests. It was a local process server who Mr. Henderson's legal contacts had helped me arrange. In the middle of the party, in front of the yoga instructor and the college roommates, Gary was served with a formal notice. It wasn't an eviction yet, but it was a notice of termination of the permitted occupancy agreement. The server explained loudly enough for everyone in the foyer to hear that the primary owner of the property, Nicole Harrison, had officially withdrawn her financial support and was preparing the house for sale. The room went dead silent. The truth was out in the open. I wasn't just the sister who didn't get an invite. I was the landlord who was closing the building. I closed my laptop in Chicago and ordered another glass of wine. The grand reveal was finally complete, and everyone now knew exactly who had been carrying the weight of the Harrison family all along. By the time the sun had completely set over the Seattle skyline, the grand Thanksgiving reveal had turned into a ghost story. Through the digital breadcrumbs left by humiliated guests, I watched as the house at 42 Maple Drive emptied in record time. People didn't stay for the cold burgers or the freezing conversation. They made excuses and fled to their own warm homes, leaving my parents and Brittany standing in a darkened museum of their own arrogance. The silence that followed the departure of the last guest must have been deafening. I imagined them sitting in the living room with their coats on, staring at the flickering candles, realizing that the person they had collectively decided to erase was the only person who had ever made their reality sustainable. I spent my evening in Chicago walking through a high-end furniture gallery, picking out pieces for my new executive apartment. I wasn't looking for things that would impress my mother or give Andre a good backdrop for a photo. I was looking for things that I actually liked. My phone continued to buzz with a new kind of message. The tone had shifted from rage to a desperate, sickeningly sweet pleading. My mother sent a long, rambling text at 11 p.m., claiming she had been under a lot of stress and that she had never meant for me to feel excluded. She said that the invitation was just a misunderstanding and that they had actually saved a plate for me just in case I showed up. She didn't mention the canceled catering or the cold house until the very end, where she begged me to turn the power back on, because your father is shivering, Nicole. I didn't reply, but I did look at the logs for the house. Without the internet and the heat, the smart home system was barely hanging on by a battery backup. I could see that Brittany and Andre had fled to a local motel using a credit card that I knew was near its limit. They had left my aging parents alone in a dark, cold house. This was the family they were so proud of building. This was the loyalty they had prioritized over mine. It was a perfect demonstration of the supply chain risk I had predicted. When the primary resource, me, was removed, the entire infrastructure of their lives collapsed because there was no backup plan. They had spent years burning the bridge that was carrying them across the river, and now they were shocked to find themselves in the water. The next morning, I received an email from the property management company I had hired in Seattle. They had sent a representative to the house to perform a wellness check and to hand-deliver the formal vacate orders. The report was clinical and brutal. The house was in a state of disarray with garbage from the failed parties scattered everywhere. My father had tried to bypass the electrical meter to get the lights back on, which was a dangerous and illegal move that resulted in a visit from the utility company to officially pull the fuse. They were no longer just without power. They were now considered to be living in an unsafe structure. My mother had apparently broken down in tears, telling the property manager that her daughter was a millionaire who was letting them starve. The property manager had simply replied that his client had provided more than enough and that the account was settled. I sat in my new office in Chicago looking at the lake, and I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I had already dropped the shoe, and it had landed exactly where it needed to. The transition from a risk director to a regional director in Chicago felt like stepping out of a suffocating fog into the crisp, clean air of a new reality. While I was settling into my high-rise office overseeing a team that actually respected my expertise back in Seattle, the Harrison family was entering the final stage of grief for their lost lifestyle. By Saturday morning, my mother and father were forced to pack their belongings into a U-Haul. They had to rent with cash borrowed from the very relatives they had tried to impress just 48 hours prior. I watched through the exterior security cameras, the only thing still running on a separate solar backup I had installed months ago, as they dragged my mother's designer sofas and the heavy dining table across the porch. They didn't have the finesse of professional movers, and I watched with cold detachment as they scratched the hardwood floors I had paid to refinish only last year. The group chat had been silent for a while until a new notification popped up. It was from Andre. He wasn't demanding money this time, he was sending a formal apology. It was a carefully worded 3-paragraph message, claiming he had been led astray by the family dynamic, and that he had always appreciated my support. He even suggested that we could meet for a private dinner in Chicago to discuss how to mend the bridges. I saw right through the logistics of his plan. His influencer statistics were plummeting because he no longer had a luxury backdrop for his content, and his sponsors were dropping him faster than he had dropped me from the Thanksgiving guest list. He wasn't looking for a sister, he was looking for a new location scout. I didn't even bother to block him, I simply deleted the thread. I was no longer a resource to be managed. The most difficult moment came when my father Gary called me from a payphone near the motel where they were staying. His voice was cracked, and he sounded like a man who had finally realized the true cost of his silence. He didn't yell and he didn't demand anything. He just asked Nicole, "How did we get here?" I told him the truth that we had been here for a long time, but I was the only one paying the toll to keep us from seeing the edge. I told him that I had officially listed the house for sale and that a local staging company was coming in on Monday to remove the last of their junk and replace it with a professional aesthetic that didn't smell like betrayal. I told him that a portion of the sale proceeds would be placed in a restricted trust for them, enough to pay for a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a senior living community. But they would never have access to the principal, and I would never be the one signing the checks. Again, the reaction from my mother was instantaneous when she found out about the senior living community. She sent a series of voice notes that were pure vitriol, screaming that she was not a charity case, and that she deserved to live in a house that matched her status. She didn't understand that her status was a fiction I had written for her. While she was screaming into her phone, I was signing the final paperwork to change the digital locks on the Seattle house. I watched the screen as the locksmith I hired arrived at the property. He didn't just change the tumblers, he installed a high-security encrypted system that was linked directly to my Chicago office. As the sun set over the Pacific, I saw my father standing at the end of the driveway, looking at the house one last time, before the locksmith pulled the gate shut, and the lights on the security panel turned a solid, unyielding red. The locks were changed, and the guest list was truly final now. 6 months had passed since the freezing chaos of that Seattle Thanksgiving. Of course, Chicago, the ice on Lake Michigan, had finally begun to crack and melt, mirroring the final layers of guilt that had once frozen my heart. I was standing on the balcony of my permanent residence, a penthouse that I bought with the bonus from my successful first quarter as regional director. The wind was still sharp, but it felt like a clean slate. I had spent half a year rebuilding my identity outside of the role of family provider. I was no longer the daughter who paid for love or the sister who bought tolerance. I was simply Nicole, and for the first time in 33 years, I knew exactly what that meant. Back in Seattle, the house at 42 Maple Drive had sold for nearly $2 million. The closing was swift and clinical. I didn't go back for the final walkthrough. I didn't need to see the empty rooms where I had once tried to buy a family. As I had promised, I placed a portion of the proceeds into a rigid ironclad trust for my parents. It provided them with a comfortable life in a quiet, well-managed senior community. But the terms were non-negotiable. There were no lump sums for Andre's business ideas, and no luxury budget for my mother's social climbing. Every month they received a notification of a paid rent and a modest stipend for groceries. They were safe, they were housed, but they were no longer my masters. I had effectively retired from being the CEO of their dysfunction. The final message from the old world came on a random Tuesday. It was a video call from an unknown number. I hesitated for a moment before answering. The screen flickered to life to reveal Brittany sitting in a cramped, cluttered apartment. The lighting was poor and the designer background was gone. She looked exhausted. She told me that Andre's career had completely collapsed after the Thanksgiving scandal and that they were struggling to make ends meet in a tiny rental. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't mention the new city or my new life. She immediately pivoted to the trust fund, asking if I could talk to the lawyers about releasing a small portion for a down payment on a house for them. She said she was family, and that family was supposed to help each other rise. I looked at her, really looked at her, and I didn't feel the familiar sting of obligation. I felt nothing but a quiet, professional distance. I told her that family does indeed help each other rise, but that she had mistaken a bridge for a ladder. I explained that she was the one who had declared the guest list final, and that I was simply honoring her wishes by remaining a stranger to her problems. I told her that she and Andre were finally equal to the rest of the world now, and that I had high hopes they would find a way to navigate their own logistics. Before she could start a new round of tears, I ended the call. I didn't block her this time. I didn't need to. Her voice no longer had the power to move me. I walked away from the screen and back to the balcony, looking out at the vast blue expanse of the lake. I had lost a house and a family, but I had gained my own life. The screen of the past didn't fade to black. It faded to a brilliant, blinding white. I was powerful, I was free, and for the first time I was exactly where I was meant to be.